When the Titanic sank in 1912, over 1,500 people died in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Nearly a century later, only one survivor was still alive. Her name was Milvina Dean, and she was just 9 weeks old when the world's most famous ship disappeared beneath the sea. How does a baby become the last person alive who once stood, however briefly, aboard the Titanic? To answer that, the story has to go back to the night everything changed for one young family, and to a ship that carried extraordinary confidence across the ocean, confidence that a single piece of ice would prove tragically misplaced. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic sailed from Southampton to New York with more than 2,200 passengers and crew. She had been described in shipping trade publications as practically unsinkable, a phrase that would haunt the disaster for the rest of the century. 4 days into the voyage, on the night of April 14th, she struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The collision tore open her hull, and in the early hours of April 15th, the ship broke apart and sank, taking more than 1,500 lives with her. Among the passengers was a family whose story would echo for nearly 100 years after the wreck settled on the ocean floor. She was born on February 2, 1912, in Branscombe, a small village in Devon, England. Her parents, Bertram and Georgette Dean, had made a decision that thousands of British families made in that era. They were emigrating. Bertram planned to open a tobacco shop in Wichita, Kansas, using money from his family's business to start a new life in America. He booked passage for himself, his wife, their 2-year-old son Bertram Vere, and their infant daughter, who traveled with them as third-class passengers, packed into the lower decks with hundreds of other immigrant families, chasing the same American promise. For most of the voyage, the crossing was uneventful, the kind of journey thousands of families made without incident every year. The Deans had sold what little they owned in England to fund the move, betting everything on a fresh start across the Atlantic. But on the night of April 14th, everything changed. Many aboard the Titanic felt only a faint jolt when the ship struck the iceberg. Some rolled over and went back to sleep, unaware of the danger. Bertram Dean did not. Somewhere below deck, he opened the cabin door. The engines had stopped. The corridor was unusually quiet. Whatever he saw or heard out there was enough. He turned back into the cabin, woke his wife, and told her they needed to move. Because they were traveling in third class, the Deans faced obstacles that many wealthier passengers did not. Third-class accommodations were located deep within the ship, and the path up to the lifeboat deck was longer and harder to navigate, crowded with confused passengers moving through narrow corridors that had never been designed for a fast evacuation. Above them, on the boat deck, officers were already loading women and children into lifeboats under Captain Edward Smith's order, working against a ship listing further into the black water with every passing minute. Yet Bertram managed to get his wife, his son, and his infant daughter up through the ship to safety. On deck, the temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the ship's band could still be heard playing, an odd, steady sound against the growing panic around the boats. Georgette Dean, carrying her daughter and holding onto young Bertram Vere, was placed into a lifeboat and lowered down into the freezing water below, one of only 20 lifeboats launched that night, far too few for the number of people still aboard. Around her, other families were being separated in the same way, husbands stepping back from the ropes as their wives and children were rowed away from the sinking ship. Bertram did not step into that lifeboat with them. As a man and as a third-class passenger, his chances of finding a seat were slim, under the maritime custom of women and children first, a rule enforced with particular strictness that night. He stayed behind on the deck of a ship that was already dying beneath him. He did not survive. His body, if it was ever recovered, was never identified. He became one of the more than 1,500 people who died in the icy waters of the North Atlantic that night, a young father whose final hours were spent making sure his wife and children had a chance to live. Somewhere in the dark, as the lifeboat pulled away, Georgette Dean watched the lights of the Titanic tilt further into the water, unaware that she had already seen her husband for the last time. Milvina would never remember that night, but history never forgot her. The surviving members of the Dean family, along with hundreds of other rescued passengers, were picked up by the RMS Carpathia, the ship that raced through the darkness in response to the Titanic's distress calls. From New York, rather than continuing on to the new life they had planned in Kansas, Georgette Dean made the decision to return home to England with her 2 children. They sailed back across the Atlantic aboard the RMS Adriatic, retracing in reverse the journey that had cost them everything, arriving in a country already gripped by newspaper headlines about the disaster and lists of the dead. Milvina grew up in England, raised largely by her mother and, for a time, by relatives. For years, she has said, she did not fully grasp the significance of what had happened to her family, or the fact that she had become, without ever choosing it, a living piece of one of history's most studied tragedies. She grew up, went to school, and eventually worked ordinary jobs, including a period as a cartographer and later work in an office supplying parts for aircraft engines. She never married and had no children of her own. For much of her adult life, the Titanic was simply a fact of her past, not the center of it. It was only later that the weight of the story began to settle on her as journalists, historians, and Titanic enthusiasts started seeking her out. In the years that followed, hundreds of Titanic survivors scattered back into ordinary life across Britain, the United States, and beyond. Many rarely spoke publicly about that night, carrying it instead as a private memory, something mentioned at family dinners rather than in newspapers. For much of the 20th century, Milvina Dean was simply one of many Titanic survivors, a name on a long list of people who had lived through that night and gone on to build ordinary lives. But every year that list grew shorter. Newspapers rarely noticed when another name disappeared from it. Survivors aged, and quietly, without ceremony, they began to die. By the 1990s, only a small number remained. Then there were 10, then 5, then 2. Each death barely made the news, yet each one moved Milvina one place closer to a title she had never asked for. In October 2007, Barbara West Dainton, who had survived the sinking as a 10-year-old girl, passed away at the age of 96. With her death, Milvina Dean became something she had never sought to be. She was now the last living survivor of the RMS Titanic, the final human being alive who had, however briefly, however unknowingly, been aboard that ship on the night it sank. The recognition that came with that title was not something Milvina had asked for, but she accepted it with grace. She became a familiar figure at Titanic commemorative events, historical societies, and museum exhibitions, often invited as a guest of honor to gatherings of historians and enthusiasts who studied the ship in extraordinary detail. She attended conventions held by Titanic historical societies in both Britain and the United States, met descendants of other passengers, and unveiled memorials dedicated to the disaster. She gave interviews to journalists and documentary filmmakers, offering what fragments of family history and personal reflection she could, even though she carried no memory of the night that had defined her entire life. Reporters often asked her the same questions about her father, about the lifeboat, about what it felt like to be the last one left, and she answered each time with the patience of someone who understood that her story no longer belonged only to her. To researchers and enthusiasts who had spent decades studying the disaster from photographs and passenger manifests, meeting her was as close as they could come to meeting the ship itself. Interest in her story had already grown in 1985 when the wreck of the Titanic was located on the ocean floor by a team led by oceanographer Robert Ballard, more than 2 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. Then, in 1997, director James Cameron released his film Titanic, which became one of the highest-grossing films in cinematic history and introduced an entirely new generation to the disaster. Suddenly, the ship that had sunk 85 years earlier was once again a global fascination, and Milvina Dean, as the youngest surviving passenger, found herself sought after by fans, researchers, and media outlets from around the world. People traveled great distances simply for the chance to speak with someone connected to the ship, and she came to embody, for many, the last human thread tying the present to that long-ago night. But fame, especially unsought fame tied to a tragedy, did not translate into financial security. In her later years, Milvina Dean faced real financial hardship. The cost of nursing home care in England placed a significant burden on her limited resources, and to help cover her expenses, she made the difficult decision to sell some of her personal Titanic memorabilia, including letters, family photographs, and items connected to the disaster that had shaped her entire life. Her situation drew sympathy from around the world, and notably, Titanic filmmakers and cast members, including James Cameron and Kate Winslet, contributed to a fund established to help support her care. It was a strange turn of history that a film dramatizing the disaster ended up helping to care for its last living survivor. Even as her health declined, she continued to receive letters and visitors from around the world, people who felt, in speaking with her, that they were touching something otherwise lost to time. Milvina Dean died on May 31, 2009, at the age of 97, in a nursing home in Southampton, the same city from which the Titanic had departed nearly a century earlier. Her ashes were later scattered near the docks the great ship had left in 1912, closing a circle that had opened before she could even walk or speak. The Titanic remains one of the most studied and remembered disasters in modern history. It survived today through photographs, ship's records, written accounts, films, and the wreck itself, still resting on the ocean floor where Ballard's team found it, slowly being consumed by rust and deep-sea microbes with every passing year. Historians continue to piece together its final hours, more than a century later, working from records, letters, and testimony left behind by people who are no longer here to ask, filling in the gaps with the same careful patience once shown by the family that carried an infant girl up through a dying ship and into a lifeboat, a decision made in a matter of minutes that would echo for nearly 100 years afterward. Every survivor who lived through that night carried the same unspoken responsibility, to remember and to be remembered. For nearly a century, there was always someone alive who had once stepped aboard the Titanic. Today, there isn't. Fade to black. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Dead Empires for more.